Kola sat on the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the floor. The room was quiet except for the sound of his own shallow breaths. His heart felt heavy, weighed down by the bitter cocktail of betrayal and heartbreak. His fists clenched as he thought of Zainab, the woman he had loved with all his heart, and Deji, the friend he had trusted more than anyone else. How could they do this to me? Kola muttered under his breath, his voice cracking. I did everything right. I gave her my love, my time, everything. And she still chose him over me. Tears streamed down his face, but he didn't bother to wipe them away. The pain felt too raw, too deep. Memories of Zainab laughing at his jokes, the long walks they shared, and the countless promises they made together played like a cruel film in his mind. He had believed those moments were real. He believed she loved him. But it was all a lie. Kola's thoughts turned to Deji, his childhood friend, the one he had shared every milestone with. Birthdays, school troubles, family celebrations, they had been like brothers. Yet, Deji had stabbed him in the back by taking the one thing that mattered most, Zainab. A few days later, Kola forced himself to act normal. He couldn't let his emotions give him away. He met Deji in their usual spot, the sitting room of Deji's apartment, and wore the mask of a man who had moved on. Deji, Kola began, his voice calm, almost too calm. I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened. Deji looked up from his seat, his face cautious. He hadn't expected Kola to approach him so soon. And, I want you to know I've let it go, Kola said with a small smile. I'm not angry anymore. I've come to terms with it. If Zainab makes you happy, then you have my blessing. Deji's shoulders relaxed, and a smile spread across his face. Wow, Kola. I didn't think you'd come around so quickly. Thank you. That means a lot to me. Kola nodded, the smile on his lips never reaching his eyes. Inside, his heart burned with hatred. He watched as Deji's face lit up with relief, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath Kola's calm exterior. Later that night, Kola sat in the darkness of his room, staring out of the window. The stars glittered in the sky, mocking him with their beauty. He didn't deserve this pain. He didn't deserve to lose the woman he loved. If they think they've won, they're wrong, Kola whispered to himself. His voice was cold, devoid of emotion. I'll make them pay for what they've done. The rage inside him had transformed into something darker. It was no longer about heartbreak or betrayal. It was about revenge. He wasn't going to let Deji and Zainab live happily ever after while he was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered heart. From that moment on, Kola began plotting. Every smile he gave, every friendly word he spoke, was part of his act. He would let them think he had forgiven them. He would let them believe he was still their friend. And when the time was right, he would strike. But for now, he would wait. In the shadows of his mind, Kola nurtured his hatred like a poisonous seed, watering it with thoughts of revenge. He was patient. He was determined. And he wouldn't stop until Deji and Zainab paid for their betrayal. Zainab stood by the kitchen counter, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her eyes were fixed on the doorway, waiting for Deji to return from his meeting with Kola. Her heart was heavy with unease. Something about Kola's sudden change in behavior didn't sit right with her. Minutes later, Deji walked in, a slight smile on his face. You won't believe it, he began, pulling out a chair to sit across from her. Kola says he's forgiven us. Zainab's eyes narrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line. Forgiven us. Just like that. Deji nodded. Yeah. He said he's let it all go and even supports our relationship now. Deji, don't you think that's a little strange? Zainab said, leaning forward. A few days ago, he could barely look at us, and now he's suddenly okay with everything? Deji sighed and rubbed his temples. I know it seems fast, but Kola's my best friend. Maybe he's just trying to move on. We've known each other since we were kids. He's not the kind of person to hold grudges. Maybe not, Zainab replied, her voice soft but firm. But people can change, especially when they're hurt. Over the next few days, Kola's behavior continued to raise suspicions. He visited often, bringing small gifts and engaging in friendly conversations. But there was something unsettling about his demeanor. His smiles seemed forced, and his eyes never quite met theirs. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Zainab turned to Deji. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice trembling. "Something's not right with Kola. I can feel it." Deji frowned. "What do you mean?" "I don't know how to explain it," Zainab replied, clutching a cushion tightly. "But every time he's around, I feel like he's hiding something. Like he's waiting for the right moment to strike." Deji sighed deeply. "Zainab, I get that you're worried, but you're letting your fear get the best of you. Kola's trying to move on. We should support him, not doubt him." But Zainab couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Her instincts told her that Kola wasn't being genuine, and she knew better than to ignore them. The next day, Zainab decided to seek advice from her Alpha, a spiritual leader she trusted. She explained the situation in detail, her voice shaky as she spoke of Kola's sudden friendliness and her growing fears. The Alpha listened carefully, nodding as she spoke. Then, after a moment of silence, he said, "Zainab, your instincts are correct. Kola is not what he seems. He is plotting against you and Deji." Zainab felt her stomach drop. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Alpha nodded. "He is consumed by jealousy and anger. You must be careful." When Zainab returned home, Deji immediately noticed the worry expression on her face. "What's wrong?" he asked, setting down the book he was reading. She hesitated for a moment, then sat beside him. "I went to see the Alpha today," she admitted. "He said Kola is planning to harm us." Deji's jaw tightened, and he shook his head. "That's impossible. Kola wouldn't do something like that." "Deji, you have to believe me," Zainab pleaded, grabbing his hand. "I know this is hard to hear, but we can't take this lightly." Deji leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "Kola's been my friend for as long as I can remember. He's like a brother to me. Why would he want to hurt us?" "Because he feels betrayed," Zainab said quietly. "And betrayal can make people do terrible things." Deji remained silent, his mind racing. The thought of Kola plotting against them felt unreal, but Zainab's fear was genuine. He couldn't ignore it. "Okay," he finally said. "Let's be careful. But I still need to see it to believe it." From that moment, an invisible tension settled over their lives. Every interaction with Kola felt like walking on thin ice. Deji and Zainab exchanged wary glances whenever Kola visited, their smiles masking the fear in their hearts. And though Kola continued to act like the perfect friend, the growing suspicion between them was undeniable. Little did they know, their doubts were not just paranoia. They were the only thing standing between them and Kola's dark intentions. Kola paced his living room, his thoughts spiraling deeper into darkness. His attempts to find supernatural help had failed miserably. Every herbalist and shrine he had visited had given him the same frustrating answer: they cannot be killed or separated. The words echoed in his mind like a curse. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. If the supernatural wouldn't help him, he would take matters into his own hands. He would poison them. That way, no one could trace it back to him. But Kola knew he couldn't do it alone. Deji and Zainab were already suspicious of him. He needed someone they trusted, someone who could get close enough to carry out the plan. That's when he thought of Emmanuel, their old friend. Emmanuel had always been loyal and naive, easy to manipulate. Kola picked up his phone and dialed Emmanuel's number. "Hello, Emmanuel." "Longest time," Kola said, trying to sound cheerful. "Ah, Kola. It's been ages. How are you? Emmanuel replied, his voice warm. I'm fine, Kola said, forcing a chuckle. But I need your help with something serious. What's wrong? Emmanuel asked, concern creeping into his tone. Kola sighed, making his voice sound heavy with sadness. It's Deji. He betrayed me. He stole Zainab, my fiancée. Can you believe that? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Deji, are you sure about this? Emmanuel asked, his voice laced with doubt. Yes, Emmanuel, Kola said, his voice growing louder with fake anger. He stabbed me in the back, and now he's parading Zainab around like I never existed. Emmanuel hesitated. This doesn't sound like Deji. He's not that kind of person. Call him if you don't believe me, Kola snapped. But I'm warning you, he'll lie to cover up what he's done. The next day, Emmanuel called Deji, eager to hear his side of the story. Deji was shocked when Emmanuel brought up Kola's accusations. Kola told you that? Deji asked, his voice filled with disbelief. That's not true. Zainab chose me because she loves me, not because I took her from Kola. I don't know who to believe, Emmanuel admitted. This whole situation is confusing. Deji sighed. I know it's hard, but you've known me for years, Emmanuel. Have I ever done anything like this before? No, Emmanuel said softly. You haven't. A few days later, Kola called Emmanuel again. Have you spoken to Deji? He asked, his voice sharp. I did, Emmanuel replied cautiously. He said Zainab chose him, and he didn't betray you. I told you he would lie. Kola shouted, his anger bubbling to the surface. Deji has always been good at twisting the truth. Emmanuel didn't respond immediately. Kola could sense his hesitation and quickly softened his tone. Look, Emmanuel, I know this is hard for you, but I need your help. I can't let them get away with this. What do you want me to do? Emmanuel asked reluctantly. Kola smiled to himself. He had him. I need you to help me get rid of them. For good. Get rid of them? Emmanuel echoed, his voice uncertain. Kola, what exactly are you asking me to do? I have a plan, Kola said, his voice steady. We'll poison them. It'll be quick and clean. No one will ever suspect us. Emmanuel fell silent. Kola pressed on. You've been their friend for years. They trust you. If anyone can get close enough to make this work, it's you. After a long pause, Emmanuel finally replied, Okay, I'll do it. But deep down, Emmanuel felt uneasy. Kola's anger seemed excessive, and his eagerness to kill Deji and Zainab didn't feel right. Emmanuel had agreed to the plan, but something told him he needed to dig deeper. As Kola celebrated his small victory, Emmanuel made a decision of his own. He would find out the truth about Kola's intentions. And if his suspicions were correct, he would make sure Deji and Zainab were safe. I need to know the truth, Emmanuel muttered to himself, grabbing his phone. He dialed Deji's number. Emmanuel, what's up? Deji answered, his voice calm but cautious. Deji, I need to talk to you, Emmanuel said, his voice urgent. Can we meet in person? It's about Kola. There was a pause before Deji responded. All right. Come over. When Emmanuel arrived at Deji and Zainab's house, he was greeted with warm smiles, but he could sense the tension in the air. They sat in the living room, the three of them, as Emmanuel hesitated to speak. Finally, he broke the silence. Kola. He's planning something, Emmanuel began, his voice low. Something terrible. Deji and Zainab exchanged a glance. What do you mean? Deji asked. Emmanuel took a deep breath. He called me a few days ago. He told me he wanted to poison both of you. He said it's the only way to get back at you for what happened. Zainab's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. Poison us, she whispered. Deji shook his head, his voice filled with disbelief. No, Kola wouldn't do that. He's angry, sure, but murder? That's not who he is. I didn't believe it at first either, Emmanuel admitted. But the way he spoke, it scared me. He's serious about this, Deji. I think he's lost his mind. What else did he say? Zainab asked, her voice trembling. He wants me to help him. He thinks I can get close to you because you trust me, Emmanuel said. He hesitated before continuing. But I couldn't do it. That's why I came here. I needed to warn you. Deji sat back, his hands running through his hair. He looked at Zainab, whose face was pale with shock. What do we do? He asked. We need a plan, Zainab said firmly. If Kola is this desperate, we can't just ignore it. We need to stop him before he does something irreversible. The three of them spent the next few hours strategizing. Emmanuel suggested they turn Kola's own plan against him. I'll pretend to go along with his plan, Emmanuel said. I'll tell him I've poisoned you. When he comes to see for himself, we'll catch him red-handed. Deji frowned. That's risky. What if something goes wrong? It won't, Emmanuel said confidently. Kola trusts me. He won't suspect a thing. Zainab nodded. We don't have a choice, Deji. This is the only way to stop him. Deji reluctantly agreed, though his heart was heavy with the thought of betraying his best friend. But Kola's actions had left him no choice. The next day, Emmanuel called Kola. Kola, it's done, Emmanuel said, keeping his voice steady. Deji and Zainab are gone. There was a brief silence before Kola's excited voice came through the line. You did it. They're really dead. Yes, Emmanuel replied. Come and see for yourself. Kola laughed, a sound that sent chills down Emmanuel's spine. I knew I could count on you, Kola said. I'll be there soon. That evening Deji and Zainab prepared for the final act of their plan. They lay on the floor, their faces pale with makeup to mimic death. Emmanuel stood by the door, his heart pounding as he waited for Kola to arrive. When Kola walked in, he froze at the sight of their lifeless bodies. Slowly, a smile spread across his face. It's done, he whispered to himself. Finally. He moved to Zainab, his smile widening as he looked at her still form. And you, he whispered. You rejected me for him. How does it feel now? But just as Kola took a step closer, Zainab's eyes fluttered open. Deji sat up, his gaze piercing and full of anger. Kola, Deji said, his voice cold and steady. What were you planning to do? Kola's face turned ashen. He stumbled backward, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Before he could move, police officers emerged from the shadows, their weapons drawn. Kola Adekunle, you're under arrest for attempted murder, one of them said. Kola dropped to his knees, his body trembling. The reality of his betrayal and the weight of his actions crashed down on him all at once. As the officers led him away, Kola's voice broke. Deji. I'm sorry. But Deji didn't respond. He simply watched as the friend he had once trusted was taken away in handcuffs, leaving behind a trail of heartbreak and regret. As the police escorted Kola out of the house, Zainab let out a shaky breath, leaning into Deji for support. Emmanuel stood silently, the weight of the night's events pressing heavily on his shoulders. Thank you, Emmanuel, Zainab said softly. If you hadn't warned us. Emmanuel shook his head. I just wish I'd seen through him sooner. Deji placed a hand on Emmanuel's shoulder. You did the right thing in the end. That's what matters. The three of them stood together in the quiet room, the tension slowly giving way to relief. Kola's betrayal had brought them to the brink, but their trust in one another had saved them. Kola was charged to court on Monday. Kola sat in the courtroom, his wrists in handcuffs. He looked around nervously, his head bowed in shame. The judge's face was stern as the prosecutor spoke. Your Honor, the evidence shows that Kola Adekunle planned to poison Deji Olawale and Zainab Adebayo. This was not an accident. It was deliberate and meant to harm them. Kola's lawyer tried to defend him, saying he was emotional and not thinking clearly, but the judge was not convinced. Kola Adekunle, the judge said, you are guilty of attempted murder. You betrayed the trust of people who considered you a friend. You are sentenced to 15 years in prison. The sound of the gavel echoed in the courtroom. Kola's head dropped, and tears rolled down his face. He was led out of the courtroom, his plan destroyed, his life in ruins. Deji and Zainab sat quietly in the courtroom as the sentence was read. They held each other's hands tightly, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. When the room cleared, they stayed behind for a moment. It's finally over, Deji said softly, though his voice was heavy with emotion. Zainab nodded, her eyes teary. I can't believe he did this to us. Kola was our friend. Emmanuel walked over to them, looking apologetic. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice low. I should have seen what he was planning earlier. Deji stood and patted Emmanuel's shoulder. You saved us in the end. That's what matters. Zainab smiled a little, though her heart was still heavy. We wouldn't be here without you, Emmanuel. Thank you. Months later, life slowly returned to normal. Deji and Zainab focused on their future together, determined to leave the past behind. Their love, tested by Kola's betrayal, was now stronger than ever. On a sunny Saturday, surrounded by friends and family, Deji and Zainab got married. Zainab wore a simple white dress, and Deji couldn't stop smiling as she walked down the aisle. I promise to stand by you, no matter what, Zainab said during her vows. And I promise to love you forever, Deji replied. When they exchanged rings and kissed, the crowd cheered. Emmanuel, sitting in the front row, clapped the loudest. He felt proud to have been part of their story and was grateful to see them happy again. In the weeks after their wedding, Deji and Zainab often talked about what had happened. One evening, they sat on their porch, watching the sunset. Do you think Kola regrets what he did? Zainab asked quietly. Deji thought for a moment before answering. Maybe. But regret doesn't change what he did. He made his choice, and now he has to live with it. Zainab sighed. I hope he finds peace, even if we can't trust him anymore. Deji nodded. Me too. But we have to focus on us now. Kola sat alone in his prison cell. The walls were cold and bare, and the silence was deafening. He thought about all the moments he had shared with Deji and Zainab, the laughter, the friendship, the bond they once had. Now, all of it was gone, destroyed by his jealousy and anger. He regretted every decision that led him to this point, but it was too late to undo the damage. Outside the prison, life moved on. Deji and Zainab built a happy life together, their love stronger than ever. Emmanuel, too, found his place in their lives again, grateful for the chance to make things right.